story that we're going to follow, and that is the release of the Federal Reserve minutes from its latest meeting, which are embargoed until 2 o'clock Eastern time. And for that, we go now to our Steve Leisman, who has the news.
Thanks, Tyler. The Federal Reserve and its March meeting were divided on Federal Reserve rate hike timing. Several participants supported a hike in June. Others supported it later in the year. A couple saw no rate hike until 2016. For me, the support in June, that several participants supported a hike in June, is news to me. Almost all the participants favored removing the word patient. They preferred the language that give them flexibility to hike on a meeting-by-meeting basis. One participant, however, objected to removing patient. They also gave us something of a checklist for when they might begin to hike, or the conditions would be in place. Further gains in the labor market, stabilization of energy prices, and leveling out of the dollar. Let me throw it back to Tyler now. Tyler?
Actually, I'll toss it over to Brian for a quick market reaction to the extent that we see any.
Yeah, and we are seeing one. In fact, there were not big gains in the Dow Jones Industrial Average ahead of that, but I think some of the more hawkish comments that Steve just gave you about the possibility of a June rate hike, at least seen by a couple of Fed governors, sending stocks down. They're now just up 2 points right now, the Dow, briefly turning negative. So it was up 21 points right when those Fed minutes were released. The Dow is now down 2. So not a big move, but you can see some of the sentiment perhaps reacting to a more hawkish Federal Reserve. The 10-year yield staying put where it is. The dollar index not moving much as well. I believe, Tyler, the world right now, America right now perhaps, is enveloped and wrapped up in that jury verdict, which we are awaiting from the Boston courtroom.
Perhaps very true, Brian. And, of course, it is an emotional and riveting scene here for all Americans, especially those people in Boston who were so intimately affected by it. We await a verdict. It has been reached in the case of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. A court was to have reconvened roughly 16 minutes ago, federal court in Boston. We expect that the jury is in the courtroom now, and that it will be announced shortly, as we say. Judge Michael Mukasey, a former U.S. Attorney General and judge, is with us and has been guiding us very patiently as we lawyers without doctorates or without degrees try and ask questions that hopefully he can help us with. You know, we talked just a moment ago about the defense that was that Tsarnaev was under the sway of his brother. How does that ring to you?
Well,
I mean, you play the hand you got, I guess. I mean, if you're the
exactly,
attorney.
you do play the hand you got, and you play the shot you're standing over. You can't change the facts, and I think that's going to be a bit of a tough row to hoe, simply because of the statements that he made on his own about how freely he was acting and so forth, and statements that show that he was pretty relaxed about the whole thing and pretty committed to it.
But also, I mean, the facts are here that the older brother, who we should mention is now dead, was 26 years old. The defense argument was that he was the mastermind here. He influenced his younger brother. Tamerlan is his name, the one who's died, the elder brother. He bought the bomb parts, he built the bombs, and he planned the attacks. That is what Judy Clark, the defense attorney, has to argue and has to convince a jury. How difficult is that job going to be?
It, again, depends on what the evidence shows. I don't know what the government is prepared to prove about that part of the background, or what they have proved already. Obviously, they're going to be permitted to counter that and to show that these two people acted more or less as equals.
Brian Sullivan asked a very interesting question, which you answered, but for those viewers who are maybe just joining us at the top of the hour, a variety of these counts, 17 of them, of the 30, carry the death penalty. But it is not required that the jury find guilt on all 17 for the death penalty to be imposed, right?
Correct. Anyone will do.
Anyone will do.
And just to recap, if you could, if he is convicted, then what? What does that jury do? How do they begin to hear evidence on whether they will indeed impose the death penalty?
Well, then each side will get an opportunity to present evidence. The prosecution will present aggravating factors, and they have to give notice in advance of which of the 15 or 16 aggravating factors they intend to rely on here. I think there are probably about 3 or 4 that are potentially applicable. They would have to have given notice in advance of that. Then the defense will have an opportunity to present mitigating factors, and they can really rely on pretty much anything from possible impaired capability to other psychological issues to the influence of his brother. Now we don't really know precisely what they're going to rely on, because they haven't been required to state that as yet. Although they have, as Alan pointed out, they did lay the groundwork for showing that it was the older brother who was the major influence here.
All right, thank you very much, guys. I want to get to Scott Wapner now, who's got some more breaking news, going to recap the developments. Take us inside, Scott.
And just to give you... Listen, I really need to go do some other things.
Okay, please feel free, Judge, if you need to go, with our thanks, and we hope we'll be able to rely on your knowledge and wisdom again soon. Judge Michael Mukasey, former U.S. Attorney General, thank you very much. Scott?
Yeah, Tyler, I was just going to give you some color in the fact that accused Boston Marathon boxer Johar Tsarnaev will literally learn his fate in a matter of moments. We are told he is now in the courtroom. The courtroom has begun to settle down. The spectators are in. Family members are in. In fact, we're told the Richard family is in the first available rows for the families. They, of course, lost their 8-year-old son, Martin Richard, one of 3 people killed in that bombing. Also interesting to note that we are 1 week shy of the 2-year anniversary of this bombing. And we do expect, again, that this verdict will come down imminently. Also worthy of noting, the reason we're looking at the pictures we are and not inside the courtroom, it's a federal court, thus TV cameras are not allowed inside. We'll be at the mercy of sketches for any sort of reaction, but we do have NBC News people inside that courtroom within the courthouse to relay the verdict as soon as it is read, and we would certainly believe that it would sort of happen in the manner that we've come to expect. There are 30 counts. The jury will come into the room, which they may be entering the room as we speak. The judge will ask them if they've reached their verdict. They will go down the list of counts. Count 1, conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. How do you find? Then the jury will give their answer, and subsequently they will go through each of the 30 charges. Should also tell you that 17 of the first 18 in which you will hear do carry the death penalty. But the media is in the room, the spectators are in the room, the defendant himself is now in the room, and we await this verdict.
All right, Scott Wapner. Scott, thank you very much. Let's bring in now Kendall Coffee, former federal prosecutor from Florida. Mr. Coffee, thank you very much for joining us. There was an 11-hour deliberation, which is an awfully short amount of time for a 30-charge case. What can we read into, if anything, from the time of deliberation and the mindset potentially of the jury?
Well, it sounds like a very conscientious jury, and I say that because the prosecution evidence was overwhelming. The defense, in many respects, barely defended it all, obviously saving whatever evidence they have for the sentencing phase. And a less conscientious jury could have just blazed through this and come back in a couple hours. But they're going through it count by count. They're studying the evidence. They know how serious it is. They know how much is at risk. And at the same time, they came back with some fairly logical questions about what a conspiracy is, what's aiding and abetting, important concepts in this case, and frankly, concepts that are not all that clear in the legal world at times.
And I want to, Kendall, I'm sorry to jump in. I do want to let our viewers know that the jurors are now apparently walking back into the courtroom. So again, folks, we are anticipating a verdict very shortly now, any moment actually, in the Johar Tsarnaev case in Boston, Massachusetts. Kendall, I'm going to go back to you, but if we have to jump in, I'm going to just forgive me immediately for interrupting you if we have to do this.
Of course.
When we go through these 30 charges, is it likely, because the jury is coming back into the courtroom, that they have indeed made a ruling on all 30, or is it possible that they will give the judge their responses for some, but still have questions, or is this definitive?
I think we're going to hear a verdict on all 30 counts. And I think the judge clarified, because a few of them may have had questions about some of the counts, when the judge further explained the law of conspiracy and aiding and abetting. So I expect 30 counts of verdict, and most everyone is expecting 30 guilties, but you don't know. The defense and nobody knows exactly what the verdict will be.
We've just heard that the verdict is about to be read. It is imminent. Very quickly, a few moments ago, Judge Mukasey said that it is common for the defense then to ask that the jury be polled. What is the purpose of that?
Well, in freakishly rare instances, a single juror might not have really wanted to reach that verdict, and they could say, I was pressured into it at that moment. It almost never happens. No one is expecting that to happen here. I'd be surprised if the defense even makes the request, except that they have to cover everything.
Let's go down to Scott. We got to jump in here right now. Let's go down to Scott Wapner, the verdict being read.
I want to tell you that Mr. Tsarnaev has been found guilty on count 1, which has just been read in the courtroom. It is a death penalty charge. The count as follows: conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. The jury finding Johar Tsarnaev guilty on count number 1. They will go through each individual count as he is standing now, as he is facing the jury and listening to each of these charges and hearing the counts against him for these bombings some 2 years ago. But again, guilty on count 1, conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. The 7 women and 5 men deliberating for a little more than 11 hours time. At time, that testimony was in fact graphic. In fact, they heard screams of one of the victims who ended up bleeding to death from this bombing, a restaurant manager, one of 3 people killed, some 260 others injured in this bombing. We'll continue to bring you the verdicts on each charge as we get them.
Okay, and I just want to remind our viewers, there are 30 overall counts, 17 of which are death penalty eligible. And although the death penalty is not applicable in Massachusetts, it is a federal case. But as you heard former U.S. Attorney General Michael Mukasey state earlier, only one guilty verdict is necessary under a death penalty eligible charge for the death penalty to be carried out. It does not mean that it will be. Sentencing will be done at a later time. This is the verdict phase of the trial. But as Scott Wapner just gave you, guilty verdict on count 1, conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. Of the first 18 different counts that you will hear, 17 of those are indeed death penalty eligible. So the more serious counts are going to be the first one that we hear. Let us go back now to somebody who joined us momentarily earlier and had to jump off, Alan Dershowitz of Harvard. Mr. Dershowitz, your reaction to count 1, please.
Well, no surprise. I mean, everybody really anticipated this, including, I think, the defense lawyers. And so we have to move on to the death penalty phase.
How, as a member of a jury, do you make that kind of deliberation? What sort of evidence is going to be presented? And what do you do with that? Obviously, this is an enormous decision that they have to make. And we've already heard from some people, including Cardinal Dolan of the Boston area, that he's against the death penalty.
Well, that will have a big impact on some jurors. The biggest decision that defense has to make at this point is whether to put Tsarnaev on the witness stand. If they do, this will be all about how they react to him as a human being. You can put the law aside. The Supreme Court set down all kind of rules for whether you apply the death penalty or not. Put them aside. This is purely emotional. On the one hand, you have the horrible, horrible, unspeakable crime done with premeditation and deliberation. On the other hand, you have a young man, perhaps influenced by his brother, that's no excuse, who might make a decent presentation to the jury if he testifies. But if he testifies, he risks being shown up as a guy with no remorse and with arrogance. And so it's a very hard decision that only the defense lawyer can make.
If he were to testify, gentlemen, would he then be subject to cross-examination by the federal prosecutor, who could, as you just said, be torn apart literally on the stand if he did that? Mr. Coffey, you said that you presumed that we would get verdicts on all 30 of the counts here. Does that? I didn't hear you say this, and I want to clarify here. Just because count 1 is guilty, that does not mean necessarily that you view it likely that all 30 counts will.
Tyler, Tyler, this is Scott Wapner.
Yes, please,
Professor Dershowitz, I just want to interrupt for just a moment, if you'd pardon me. Counts 2, 3, and 4, also death penalty charges, guilty on all 3 of those counts. So the first 4 counts that have been read inside this courtroom, all returning a guilty verdict for Johar Tsarnaev, and each one of those does carry a death penalty charge. Forgive my interruption, Tyler. I'll send it back to you, and I'll interrupt as necessary.
I was asking Mr. Coffey, now we know that the first 4 charges are all guilty. Do you then presume that all of the remaining ones will similarly be found guilty or not?
I think it's likely, and I think some of the jurors were not sure about some of the counts. For example, the murder of the police officer, which apparently, according to Tamerlan Tsarnaev, shortly before he was killed, he was the one that did it. But I think as the judge explained it in the law of conspiracy and aiding and abetting, it apparently resolved whatever questions some of the jurors may have had, and I think more likely than not we'll see guilties on all the counts.
Does that make it more likely, Alan, that this jury is going to find in favor of the death penalty the more of these counts that come in that are guilty?
No, I don't think so. I think the strategy of the defense was let the prosecution put its whole case forward with all the emotional impact, and that emotional impact will be a little bit dissipated when the penalty phase comes in. And the defense, I think, quite brilliantly didn't put forward their main issues on defense. They're saving that so it'll be fresh during the penalty phase. Judy Clark plays the long game, and the long game is not guilt or innocence. The long game is death penalty or one juror holding out. That's all you need under federal law.
Kendall Coffey, that is an extremely important point here because, listen, we've got now 4 guilty verdicts on the first 4 counts that we have read. That alone makes Tsarnaev death penalty eligible, but your point is well taken. This needs to be unanimous, and Judy Clark has done a great job in the past with Tim McVeigh, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and others in trying to humanize her clients to the point where, listen, she's not saying they are not guilty. Everybody agrees in the guilt. It is, Mr. Dershowitz, getting everybody in one room, whatever their moral or religious or ethical beliefs, to say that Johar Tsarnaev should be put to death. This will likely, will it not, be a more difficult and higher hurdle than the actual verdicts?
Well, Professor Dershowitz explained it very well. It's all about the defense getting just one juror to hold out for a life sentence rather than death. And while it's going to be difficult, given the horrors of the evidence and the horrors of the crime, even the fact that the jury came back with a question about conspiracy and aiding and abetting suggests that there's already an understanding that there is some separation in the culpability of the 2 brothers, and that could be the foundation for the defense. As we know, as Professor Dershowitz noted, the work of the defense lawyer here really doesn't even begin until her client is already found guilty of capital crimes.
So Mr. Dershowitz, you hinted at the possibility that now Attorney Clark's hard work, the long game, starts, and you suggested maybe that there were some parts of her defense argument that she hasn't made or hasn't made in a full-throated way. What would those include?
Those would include all the mitigating factors. And remember, under federal law, you can go beyond the listed mitigating factors and focus on anything that you think might be mitigating, something that happened to him as a child, anything in the world. Look, he's very lucky. He has the second best criminal lawyer in America. The first one is Kendall Coffey, who's on your show right now, because he's the guy I picked to defend me. But she is a terrific, terrific lawyer.
All right, Alan, I was just going to say, just to sort of recap what we have learned after 11 hours of jury deliberations, we now know that at least 4 counts, Johar Tsarnaev has been found guilty, and all 4 of those actually carry the death penalty. Tyler, sorry.
I want to check with our news desk, if I might. Forgive me for talking through here. Do we have verdicts on any of the other counts? Can someone advise us?
I'll advise you, Tyler. No, we're still waiting for those other counts. Just to give you an idea of the counts that we still await, there is count 5, possession and use of a firearm during and in relation to a crime of violence resulting in death and aiding and abetting. Count 6, conspiracy to bomb a place of public use resulting in death. Count 7, bombing of a place of public use resulting in death, aiding and abetting. What's interesting about part of those, actually I'm told now through count 9 are all guilty. So counts 1 through 9 are all now guilty, each of which do carry a death penalty charge. In fact, the only charge within the first 18 that does not carry the death penalty, as I have it, is count 11, which is conspiracy to maliciously destroy property resulting in death. That one not carrying a death penalty.
So the first 9 are now guilty charges, including the ones you just read there. So 9 guilty.
With that all carry
and I think,
penalty.
and let's back in here. It seems at this point now to be a little bit.
11 does not.
I don't know. We've got 9 guilty pleas on counts that are death penalty eligible. It is clear that whatever happens with the remaining counts, Johar Tsarnaev's fate is now going to be in the sentencing. Is it not? I'm not saying the rest of the counts are not meaningful. They certainly are. They each carry their own weight, and in some cases, they are going to be made to make a point, especially if he is found guilty on all 30 points. But let's look ahead now, because the reality of Johar Tsarnaev's future existence will now go into the sentencing phase. If you are Judy Clark, the defense,
and
what
Brian
do you
Sullivan,
say?
let me forgive me. Count guilty through counts 12 now. Counts 1 through 12.
Thank you.
Are all guilty.
Who wants to jump in and answer?
Kendall Coffee, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Well, the focus is, in probably for weeks now, the defense has been focusing on thinking ahead of and how their sentencing case is going to play out. And what we don't know is what do they have about the defendant's life before Boston, and in terms of things that they could bring out, and his upbringing, his growing, the influences. What we assume is that they're going to concentrate on the fact that he was less culpable, that they will say wasn't directly involved in the bomb making and only mildly involved in the actual preparation, and that there was this overwhelming dominance by this older brother that he idolized, and that the emotional control, the domination of his older brother, certainly not enough to excuse his crimes or avoid a life sentence, but is enough to say that this guy who is 19, completely dominated by an older brother, is somebody who should not be put to death for his crimes.
How long does this whole process take, Alan, when the time that they're going to start to hear the evidence and the whole sentencing trial begins?
Nobody knows for sure, because the prosecution has to give the defendant notice as to what aggravating factors they're going to put forward, but the defense does not have to give notice as to what mitigating factors it's going to put forward. And so we have no idea and won't have any idea how long the defense case will take, whether he will be put on the witness stand or not, whether his friends will come forward, whether family members will come forward. And so it's impossible to predict. I mean, the only prediction I will make, I've made it previously, is I predict that Tsarnaev will not die in the death chamber, that he'll die in prison, that one way or another he will not be executed, and that I think it's a monumental waste of time and resources to be seeking the death penalty in a case like this. Also, when you seek the death penalty, you get Judy Clark. She wouldn't have taken this case probably if they had sought life imprisonment. So I think all in all, it was the wrong decision by the prosecution to seek the death penalty, particularly in Boston, where, as you mentioned before, the highly respected cardinal in a city that has a large number of quite religious Catholics has come out against the death penalty. There are other churches and other religious groups and other civic groups and civil libertarians who are against the death penalty. He would be made a hero of. If he's given the death penalty, suddenly all the anti-death penalty people will gather around him, and he doesn't deserve that. He deserves to die in obscurity in a prison, hated by his fellow prisoners.
Yeah. And Professor Dershowitz, let me just say as well that counts 1 through 14 now is where we are through, and they are all guilty. Again, approaching the end of the charges that actually would carry the death penalty. It is 17 of the first 18. We are through the first 14, and all are guilty verdicts against Johar Tsarnaev.
Let's bring in Robert Shapiro right now. Thank you, Scott Wapner. Mr. Shapiro, welcome to the program. In your experience, how difficult might it be, given that we don't know the moral, the ethical, the religious beliefs of any of the 12 women and men that are in that room, how difficult will it be to convince all 12 of them, and indeed it does have to be unanimous, that a death penalty is the appropriate sentence for Johar Tsarnaev?
You know, if there ever was a case for the death penalty, and I'm not an advocate of the death penalty, this certainly qualifies. This is a horrendous act that has affected everybody who not only was at that event, but in this country. The fear factor of going to public events. So it's very, very difficult to predict how 12 individuals who you do not know, who you just interview basically, and who say, yes, in the appropriate case, we could give the death penalty, if they will actually follow that. If, in fact, they will follow that instruction, even though the state does not have a death penalty statute, I think the likelihood is that they are going to get a majority of the people, that is, all of the people, to vote for the death penalty in this case.
Well, you have Professor Dershowitz who disagrees on that point. But you raised an interesting point, Mr. Shapiro. And let me ask Professor Dershowitz, if I might, how much does the defense attorney know about the jurors, and how might she craft her argument to one or more jurors whom she believes intuitively or based on fact might be most persuadable that a death penalty is not warranted here?
It's a very, very good question. In the federal court, you get to know less about jurors than you do in some state courts. So I would say that she doesn't know as much as she'd like to know about the jurors, but she probably knows enough. And there's enough experience and intuition for her to be focusing on, if not one juror, certainly a handful of 3 or 4 jurors. Any experienced criminal lawyer will know we all have anecdotes about thinking that this one juror would be the best and turned out to be the worst. Bob Shapiro's on the phone. We remember Anise Aschenbach, who we all thought would be the worst juror in the O.J. Simpson case, and she came down with a verdict of acquittal, although she regretted it afterwards. You know, predicting jury voting is very, very difficult.
Bob, I wonder if the age of Mr. Tsarnaev matters here at all, will come up in this hearing, will influence the jury, will influence the defense. And that is, he was 19 years old at the time of the bombing. They claim influenced by his elder 26-year-old brother. He's now 21 years old. Does that play a role here?
You know, anything can play a role in this case. But I think at the end of the day that this crime is so horrific, the amount of victims so unprecedented, that if there ever was a case where somebody was going to be considered for the death penalty, this is the case.
And when we look to sentencing, let's say that in sentencing, Mr. Shapiro, go ahead.
Forgive me for a minute.
Yes.
I do want to interrupt you because we've just heard the verdict for charge 18. It is guilty as well, and that is significant because that does end the readout, at least, of the death penalty charges within this case. Johar Tsarnaev found guilty on all 17 of the 18 death penalty eligible charges, found guilty on all 18 that have been read within the courtroom thus far.
All right, Scott Wapner, thank you very much. Robert Shapiro, I know we cannot say if the death penalty is not enforced, if somebody or multiple people hold out, do we have any idea where Johar Tsarnaev may serve his time? Would you imagine that if he does go to prison as opposed to ending up with capital punishment, would it likely be at the ADX facility in Colorado, which houses Zacharias Moussaoui, Terry Nichols from the Oklahoma City bombing, Vincent Bassiano, the Bonanno crime family bosses? Do you believe that's where he would end up?
You know, this is a very interesting question. Judges have absolutely no control in the federal district court. They often make recommendations at the request of defense counsel should there be a jail sentence or a life imprisonment sentence, but it's totally up to the Bureau of Prisons. In this case, you have somebody who would be put in the most protective place because of the fear of other inmates trying to attack him. And my personal view on this case is the death penalty is too good for this man.
What do you mean by that, Robert?
I think he needs to have the absolute maximum amount of suffering that one could get in a humane setting in our prison system, and think each and every day about all the harm that he has done to the people. The death penalty is in, it's out, and it's something that he asked for. He wrote it on the side of the boat.
And it sounds like you believe then that Johar Tsarnaev, should he be put into prison, his life would be in perpetual danger there, would it not?
Without a question. Without a question. He will have a target on his back the minute he walks in.
Alan,
and that's why they'll probably put him in the supermax, not because they fear he'll escape or become a jihadist again. He's a young man, but to protect him from other inmates. And I suspect he's going to have, 1 hour a day of exercise in the yard and 23 hours a day and what is virtual solitary confinement if he doesn't get the...
And you've talked a lot about, Alan, what Judy Clark needs to argue here in his defense. What about what the prosecutors are going to need to argue as they push for capital punishment?
Well, that's going to be very hard for them because they have essentially put their case forward in the prosecution case. I don't think they have very much left to do. What are they going to do, show the film again? The film is horrible. You watch that film and you say to yourself, Bob said, if anybody deserves the death penalty, this guy does. Walks past children, knowing he's going to blow these children up. And then he goes and buys a bottle of milk and goes back to his dorm and works out. I mean, the prosecution is just going to repeat it. And the jury is going to say, well, we heard this already. We're waiting to hear something fresh. They're going to hear fresh material from the defense.
This point that you're making is, I think, an important one as well, because it goes to the state of mind, because the defense is that he is under some sort of psychic control of his older brother. But yet he tweets out, stay safe, people. I'm a stress-free kind of guy. These are not the actions of somebody that is under the mental control of somebody else.
I don't think he was under the mental control of his brother. I think it's a fake defense, but I do think that it's a defense that allows Judy Clark to put forth many mitigating factors. I don't think the jurors are going to say to themselves, we're saving this guy from death because he was under the influence of his brother. They're going to use that as a way of looking at and thinking about all the emotional factors in his life, how he was treated as a child, and they're going to be looking to see if there's anything mitigating that could save him from what his crime clearly deserved.
And what would that be? What could there possibly be?
Emotional trauma that he experienced as a child through his parents. Who knows? We don't know, and we won't know until the defense puts it on, because there's no obligation to notify the prosecution or to put forward any advance indication of what the mitigating factors are going to be. And they're not limited to the mitigating factors listed in the statute. They can put forward anything that's arguably relevant, the Supreme Court has said.
Kendall Coffee, not that we haven't gone over this before, but as we move to this penalty phase of the trial, how long would you anticipate it might take, both in terms of the presentation of the evidence aggravating, mitigating, and then deliberations? Is it going to be as long? Is it going to take as long as this first trial did?
It may not take as long, but I expect it'll be a couple of weeks. I don't think the defense, knowing what's at stake, is going to get up with 4 witnesses as they did during the guilt or innocence phase. And the prosecution's work doesn't consider itself to be done. I agree with Professor Dershowitz that they can't simply repeat what they've already done. It was painful, brutal for the jury in some respects, and they could burn some of the jurors out on it. But I think what they will rely on is a lot of victim impact testimony, witnesses who lost a loved one or who lost a limb, and talk about the impact of the crime. And I think they'll try to present more of that. And I think the defense is going to be very resourceful, may still be considering putting the defendant on the stand, although most of us looking at this believe that if they can't present him in a state of remorse, complete remorse, in a way that's convincing, better keep him off the stand. I think the deliberation will be longer than this. I do not think this is going to be an easy deliberation over life or death.
It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy to sort of tune out the public opinion and emotion that has surrounded this, which the jury needs to do. It's hard to believe that it was nearly 2 years ago to the date, the Boston Marathon bombing, April 15th, 2013, where 3 were killed, 260 people injured, and among the all three that were killed were under the age of 30. Bob, it's going to be very difficult for this jury to sort of tune out the court of public opinion.
I agree with that totally.
Go ahead, Bob.
You know, my feeling is this. The prosecution has put on their case. They have put on the case for the death penalty. There obviously are going to be some people who would like to be heard, and the prosecution is going to allow them to be heard, to express how their lives have been unalterably changed as a result of this horrendous act. This case, in my view, is going to come down to one or two jurors that will need to be convinced that the death penalty is the appropriate punishment in this case.
Alan?
I agree, but here's the problem. You're going to get jurors. You're going to get victims, and I know some of the victims. I actually know some of the people. A young woman who was a fantastic dancer, who was largely disabled for a while. I know others. They're going to get up there, and they're going to talk about what a horrible impact it's had on their lives. And then, if allowed to be asked this question, they're going to be asked, do you think he should die? And they're going to say no. They're going to say no. This is Boston. You're going to get victims who have been horribly, horribly hurt. Maybe even some who have lost relatives who have died, who are going to say, no, we don't think he should get the death penalty, if the judge allows that question to be asked and answered.
That's a fascinating thought there, that they would be asked.
What this is really going to come down to is, at the end of the day, is this country one that really supports the death penalty? If it is, he will get the death penalty. If it isn't, he has a chance not to get it.
That's right.
Because there can be no more horrific case than this one.
And I think right now, let's take a moment to, I think, say the names of the victims. Let's put them up as well. We've heard a lot about Johar Tsarnaev, who's now guilty on every count that has been announced so far. His only fate will be whether or not he dies in prison or dies through capital punishment. But let's not forget, there were 3 killed in the initial bombing. All right, so count 30, guilty there, so it's unanimous. All right, let's talk about the victim for a second. 29-year-old Christy Campbell. She was a restaurant manager. 23-year-old Lingxing Lu, an exchange student from China. And perhaps the saddest case of all was 8-year-old Martin Richard, who the jury heard the testimony from his father on the stand about when the bomb went off, and he looked down and he saw the lifeless body of his 8-year-old son, Martin Richard. Later on, 26-year-old Massachusetts Institute of Technology police officer Sean Collier was shot and killed by the Tsarnaevs as well. So 4 dead, many, many, many more injured in a city that had to deal with days of terror in the wake of this as the manhunt began, all while now the guilty Johar Tsarnaev was buying milk and sending out tweets.
Well, we have come to the point where we now know that he is guilty, Tsarnaev, on all 30 counts, including all 17 of the ones that carry the death penalty. The trial will now, at an undetermined pace, move to the sentencing phase, at which time the jurors will deliberate whether Tsarnaev lives or dies. We want to thank our guests, Robert Shapiro, Alan Dershowitz of Harvard, and Kendall Coffee, former federal prosecutor, as we wrap our coverage of this verdict in the Johar Tsarnaev case. I'm going to move off stage along with Sarah and turn it over to Brian Williams.
Thank you very much. And let's get his face off there. He is guilty on all 30 counts here. Only his fate is left to be determined. We're going to take a quick break. We are CNBC, the worldwide leader in business news, and we're going to get you caught up on what the Federal Reserve Minute said, what the markets are doing. We're going to be back with the markets, with the Fed. Steve Leisman, all right after this. All right, welcome back. It is 2:40 here Eastern Time. Let's get back down to the big market story today. That is one that broke at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, the Federal Reserve Minutes. And Steve Leisman, I know you touched on it very briefly. We had to cover the trial. Now let's move on past that. Some really surprising thoughts, comments from the Federal Reserve about a possibility of a June rate hike.
Right, and what's interesting is these comments are 3 months old, but we have comments from today, Brian, about June as well. Let me remind people what the FOMC said about, or this division in the Fed about when to hike rates. You have several participants. By the way, in Fed speak, there's all participants, most participants, and then I think several is in the third order. So we don't know how many, but several supporting a hike in June. Of course, that was 3 weeks ago before the weak jobs report for March. Others support a hike later in the year, and 2 support a hike, no hike until 2016. But New York Fed President Bill Dudley, speaking just this morning, said that the June meeting was in play for a rate hike. Meanwhile, I did an interview this morning at the Council of Foreign Relations with Fed Governor Jay Powell. Here's what he said about June.
There'll be, for the first time, a discussion about whether we should raise the target range for the federal funds rate at the June meeting. We said we wouldn't do that in all likelihood at the April meeting, and we've said we would do it at the June meeting. So, and for every meeting thereafter, there will be that conversation on the current path.
Brian, let me tell you what Jay Powell said when I asked him, well, are you going to do it in June? It's an irrelevant question. There are two jobs reports between now and June. No, his decision on June, it was irrelevant. I knew you were going to think it that way.
Well, if we're seeing it, I would say that nothing any of the Fed members do is irrelevant. It may be less relevant than what the chair wants to do.
No, but what he meant was it's irrelevant whatever decision I make now about June. And the reason is because there are two jobs reports. There's all kinds of data between now and then. And if that data does indeed firm, I think what I'm hearing from guys out there, from these Fed folks, is that June is a possibility. September, probably the better bet, but I would not write it off right now.
And we've had all this data, which has, some of it has surprised to the downside.
Most of it, yeah.
And everyone's, well, is it the weather? Is it the dollar conversion? Is it oil? Could it be? Remember, as our theory has been on the 2 o'clock show for a couple of months, and we have been, shall I say, widely derided for our views, and by our views I mean mine, which is basically that there is going to be a downside to the data from weak oil because it will hit jobs, it will hit housing, it will hit other things. Even if the economy is still strong, the weak oil theory may give the data a weaker look, and the false read that things are slowing more than they are. One wonders if the Fed, and this is a question to you, I suppose, can see through that.
I think they are thinking they're going to see through that. I think they feel like there's momentum in the economy. And what I want to also point out, Brian, is the market has seen through that. Guys, if you could put up an intraday on the Dow or the 10-year, whatever you got there first, what you can see is a pretty substantial reaction. There's the 10-year yield, and so it fell, it looked like by about 3 basis points or so. And then it came right back, and the Dow, of course, and the S&P went down. I think it was 8 or 9 points, and then came back up, and I think it's either flat on the day or maybe down a point or something like that. There you go. So there's that round trip right there, Brian. So the market seems to be looking through this right now. June is in play, but I think only if there's strong economic data underneath it.
All right, Steve Leisman. Steve, thank you very much. Thanks for your patience, buddy. I know it's a big day. A lot of different stuff going on here. All right, so Steve briefly touched on how stocks reacted to the Fed. Let's go down to the New York Stock Exchange. Bob Pisani, we were up 21. Federal Reserve stuff came out. We fell just a couple of points. We're sort of in the middle. Is there a reaction to the Federal Reserve down there, or is it really steady as she goes?
Yeah, I think there was a little confusion around the comments about some participants wanted a June rate hike. And if you put up the S&P, I think Steve's right. That's why the market dropped initially on confusion about that. But it came back very quickly. And I'll tell you why I think it came back. Everybody down here seems to agree. Remember, these minutes, Brian, were March 17th and 18th. This was before the disappointing non-farm payrolls report. So the feeling down here is that if we were to have this Fed minutes, the FOMC meeting today, the minutes would be even more dovish today than they were just several weeks ago. And I think a lot of people, as Steve said, saw through that, and that's why the markets essentially have come back. By the way, I keep getting asked what happens on Fed days when the FOMC has minutes. We asked our friends over at Ken Show, and the bottom line is a pretty muted reaction overall. The S&P, there's been a number of these, 81 releases since 2005 in the last 10 years, and the S&P has been positive 59% of the time, and an average return of flat completely. And even the yields on the 10-year have been only positive half of the time, and very, very meager returns as well. So the bottom line is there's not a lot of big movement on the markets on FOMC minutes days. Brian, back to you.
Very interesting stuff there from Bob Pisani and from Ken Show. Thank you very much. Let's get the bond market reaction to the minutes of the latest Federal Reserve meeting. Rick, again, we saw a little buying come into the bond market. The yield's now back below 1.9% on the 10-year.
You know, I didn't see that the 10-year really did much, but if you look at the 2-year, the shortest maturity, of course, on the coupon curve, it definitely saw rates move up a bit. And if you look at the very long end of the market, rates are already coming down and we had some volatility. But really, the issue here today is about the curve. And if you look at 5s to 30s, no doubt about it, we flattened 3 to 4 basis points, which makes sense. All you have to do is have a discussion about whether you may raise rates, and this seems to be what happens. The dollar index, the last chart, if you follow the pieces, Brian, you know, the euro had volatility, the yen had volatility, it wasn't crystal clear. But when you synthesized all of that through the dollar index, you could clearly see it was one of the winners as well, holding on to some of the gains. Will the Fed actually raise rates? I don't know. But I think that the market has a pretty good handle that they're not sure either.
Well, we do know, Rick, the Fed will raise rates. It just may not be this year. Or it could be.
Well, you know.
At some point,
if I told you that,
or maybe not.
If I told you that somebody's going to buy your house for sale, it might not be this year, it might be next year. Well, you know, I'm not sure that's a whole lot of information. What if the fourth quarter we go into recession? So, you know what? I know it's real easy to talk about all this as if we really have a handle on what that group of people, you know, are doing that are replacing the aggregate tens of thousands of people that used to have price discovery to come up with the actual levels. But I think it's going to be a whole lot messier than they lead on.
Price discovery. I haven't heard that phrase in a while, and there's a reason why.
Yeah,
your point is well taken, Rick. Your point is well taken. Thank you very much. All right, meantime, oil falling big today. Let's go Jackie D at the NYMEX. You know, Jackie, oil, last couple days, hey, everything's fine. We're starting to see the bid come back in. Whoops, looks like the inventory build just a wee bit higher than we thought it might be.
Absolutely, and that certainly pounded oil today. There was some sort of mentality in the pits to sell on the strength that we've seen. Then you get a near 11 million barrel inventory build, and I told you yesterday if we get a monster number, you're going to see selling. That's exactly what happened. Also very interesting to note that the Fed minutes tangentially impacted the oil trade because selling intensified towards the close. One of the reasons is because the dollar started to strengthen. The dollar hadn't been doing much all day. And of course, that sends oil usually to the downside as well. Now, traders are back to this push-pull notion that we've got the fundamentals versus geopolitical risk on the table. Of course, the geopolitics we can't control. But when it comes to fundamentals, a build like this shows us there's a lot of supply out there in the marketplace, especially, Brian, when Saudi Arabia comes out and says it had record output in March, 10.3 million barrels.
That's because Saudi Arabia's average cost per barrel is estimated to be somewhere between $3 and $5 per barrel.
That's right. And so that is why the Saudis have said they can withstand some of this pricing pressure. But at the same time, you and I have discussed this before when it comes to their social spending. That certainly brings the cost up somewhere to around $80 a barrel. So they definitely are probably being hurt by this. And it's interesting to see that they're digging their heels in. They're still producing more. You know, they raised prices to Asia the other day saying that demand is ticking up. So potentially that may be a place where we see recovery. But I really think, and analysts that I've spoken to say we need to see more evidence of that.
At $50 a barrel, Saudi Arabia is doing just fine, but they might have to downgrade from 500-foot yachts to 350-foot yachts in the future.
Well, that definitely is the question. That definitely is
Fewer British soccer teams. Jackie, thank you very much. Okay. Sure. By the way, as oil has one of its worst days in a long time, down over 6%, every oil stock on my screen, except for one, Occidental Petroleum, is down, and Occidental is up 1 cent. Not a good day for the oil stocks as well. Power Lunch. We'll be right back.
Good afternoon, everyone. Tyler Matheson. Today's top breaking news, the guilt on all 30 counts of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev in connection with the Boston bombing, a bombing that cost the lives of Christy Campbell, Li-Ling Lu, Martin Richard, and a 26-year-old MIT officer, Sean Collier. The trial now, guilty on all 30 counts, 17 of which carried the death penalty. The trial now moves to a death penalty phase. The judge has said that could begin as early as next week. There will be no court tomorrow or the next day. The jurors will get a couple of days off. The jury will then be reunited with the alternate jurors. A statement from Boston's mayor within just the past few minutes saying that I'm thankful that this phase of the trial has come to an end and I'm hopeful for a swift sentencing process. I hope today's verdict provides a small amount of closure for the survivors, families, and all impacted by the violent and tragic events surrounding the 2013 Boston Marathon. We are waiting to see whether any of the prosecution team or the defense team comes out and speaks to the microphones arrayed out there, Brian, outside of federal court in Boston. Brian Sullivan, back to you.
And if and when that happens, Tyler, obviously we will carry that live. Thank you very much. For now, let's get more reaction. trial. Bring in attorney Daryl Cohen of Cohen, Cooper, Estep, and Allen. He is the former assistant attorney in Miami-Dade County, Florida, and former assistant district attorney in Atlanta. Thank you for joining us. Your reaction to the verdict?
Well, thank you for having me. My reaction to the verdict is exactly what the jury should have done. This was terrorism that equaled murder, and it was mass murder, and they had to send a message to him and to anyone else who may decide that this is the way to go.
And do you believe, though, that the 11 hours, which is actually quite a short amount of time for a trial of this size and a 30-count case, but do you believe that the 11 hours tells us something, perhaps, of the way the jury is thinking about sentencing?
Well, I think because there was minimal amount of evidence put up for the defense, the 11 hours was appropriate. I suspect there was some back and forth with the jurors about the death penalty and some that had a more difficult time than others. And yes, I think the 11 hours being a very brief amount of time for the jury to deliberate is telling us that when the penalty phase comes as early as next week, that they're going to find that he should be killed, he should be put to death, should have the death penalty.
And do you believe that's ultimately what will happen? And I just want to remind our viewers that in sentencing, it does have to be unanimous. All 12 jurors will have to decide on capital punishment. Daryl, do you believe that's what will happen?
I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I'd be very surprised if it was otherwise, and quite frankly, I'd be very disappointed.
The only real defense here was not the ifs and the whats and the whens. They conceded that. We saw him crawl out from underneath the boat, blood-soaked, on that night after the shootout in Watertown, Massachusetts. The only aspect of this is trying to humanize him, trying to say maybe that he was under control of some sort of his, mental control or scared of his brother, whatever it might be. How do you do that? How do you think, because we're not privy to the arguments, Daryl, if you had to take the other side and try to defend him, and I'm not even going to say his name, how would you do it?
Well, the first thing I would do is try to show that his brother was an evil empire all unto himself. The second thing I would do is show that I was the little brother and I idolized my older brother for whatever the reason, and he could do no wrong, and when he told me to do something, I did it. Now, what else would I do? I would bring in some neighbors, some family to show that he was a little boy and he was beat up. A little boy, he was abused. A little boy, as he got older, never grew up and was just a sad state of affairs and not a murderer or not a terrorist.
And I understand it's a tough position to be in to try to do that. Obviously did not work. Guilty in all 30 counts. Just the question of whether or not he will serve life in prison or capital punishment. Daryl Cohen, thank you very much. Folks, thank you for tuning in to Power Lunch here. Difficult day. Boston strong. Thinking about the victims. Thinking about you, Boston. We're with you. Closing Bell picks up coverage right after this.